Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi Christian University. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights, and each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight for the week is astronaut Buzz Aldrin's observance of communion on July 20th, 1969. Before the Apollo 11 mission, Aldrin's pastor provided him with a small communion kit containing a silver chalice, bread, and wine. After the lunar module Eagle landed safely on the moon, Aldrin, an elder at Webster Presbyterian Church near Houston, radioed mission control with a simple request. Quote, "This is the LM pilot. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever and wherever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours and to give thanks in his or her own way." End quote. Inside the lunar module, before stepping onto the lunar surface, Aldrin quietly read from John 15:5, received communion, and spent a few moments in prayer. NASA chose not to broadcast the communion ceremony publicly during the mission, as the agency had faced legal controversy over religious expression following the Apollo 8 Genesis reading. Aldrin later shared the communion account in his writings and interviews. Our next historical highlight and the subject of our deep dive is the departure of the Pilgrims for the New World. The Pilgrims were English Separatists who believed the Church of England had drifted from Scripture's teachings. They objected to the Church's unscriptural ceremonies, hierarchical government, and traditions from the Roman Catholic Church retained after the English Reformation. Separatists faced fines, imprisonment, and other legal penalties because of their refusal to conform. Many first fled to the Dutch Republic, where they enjoyed greater religious liberty. However, they wanted to preserve their English identity and rear their children in a distinctly Christian community, so they decided to establish a new settlement across the Atlantic. On July 22, 1620, in the Old-Style calendar, the Mayflower departed from Southampton, England, carrying the Pilgrims and other passengers toward North America. After a difficult voyage of more than 2 months, the ship reached Cape Cod in November 1620, where the settlers signed the Mayflower Compact before establishing Plymouth Colony. Our final historical highlight for the week is St. Bridget of Sweden, who died in Rome on July 23, 1373, after years of traveling throughout Europe, encouraging spiritual renewal within the Church. Born into a noble Swedish family around 1303, Bridget married, had 8 children, and was later widowed. She devoted the remainder of her life to prayer, charity, and religious reform. She founded the Order of the Most Holy Savior, which established monasteries for both men and women under the leadership of an abbess, an unusual structure for the medieval church. She became widely known for her reported visions and spiritual experiences, which she dictated to secretaries and which were eventually compiled into a collection called Revelations. These writings emphasized the suffering of Christ, called for repentance, and urged both political leaders and church officials to pursue holiness and justice. During the tumultuous years of the Avignon papacy, Bridget was an outspoken advocate for reform, repeatedly urging the Pope to return the papal seat to Rome. Canonized in 1391, less than 20 years after her death, Bridget remains one of the patron saints of Europe to this day. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with David Hall of Harvard Divinity School about the departure of the Pilgrims for the New World.
Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are focusing this week on a date in 1620. There we go, right? Which is actually the day that as we call them, Pilgrims left from the Netherlands that eventually ended up making it on the whole Mayflower trip. And as we talk more and more and more about America's founding and the 250th and talk about the early settlers and the people who came to America. Certainly, the Pilgrims, as we call them, are ring true from that. And we are so glad to have as a repeat guest Dr. David Hall, who is a retired professor at the Harvard Divinity School, who's going to talk with us. You visited with us, Dr. Hall, back in episode 17 that we did on the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and
I remember
Reverend
that.
Hooker and all that was involved in that. So thank you for joining us again. We appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with
Absolutely.
you.
Well, it seems to me just like a whole lot of good stories. Okay, what's the old adage? We never want to let the truth get in the way of a good story. But for us, truth is important. There are a lot of myths and misunderstanding or thought processes and mysteries maybe about really what happened at the first Thanksgiving and who the Pilgrims were and who they were not. And so we really want to kind of unpack some of that today. But tell us generally, as I tell my classes sometimes, keep in mind that all of the Pilgrims were Puritans, but not all Puritans were Pilgrims, right? So tell us a little bit about what a separatist is and what was going on and what they were fleeing from that drove them this direction. That's a big question, I know.
Sure. It's pretty straightforward to answer, though. So when the Puritan movement arose in England in the late 16th century, it had a couple of major complaints, major goals, I should say. It was not a sectarian movement. It wanted to take over the Church of England and run it
Mm,
in a proper way. And that meant doing away with every scrap of Catholicism that remained. And there was a fair amount of Catholicism in the Book of Common Prayer, which was the official liturgy. And then there were bishops who were, from a biblical point of view, not biblical, I put it that way, come in later on in the Catholic tradition. There was no place really for lay people to have a participatory role in choosing their ministers, which was a Puritan demand. They didn't want the church to be headed by the civil monarch. They wanted it to be headed
mhm,
by Christ. So they had what's called in Calvinism, Reformed tradition, the two kingdoms theory. They're partners, but they're completely separate in terms of authority. The church has its church decides matters of doctrine. It decides who's minister, who's member of the church. It decides matters of liturgy. And in England, it was actually the monarch, who happened to be Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, in this period, who had the final say in all these matters. And she was not reluctant to weigh in on these things, by the way. So, the Puritan movement was frustrated because of the political situation, and so frustration breeds restlessness, and
mm,
restlessness breeds why don't we just follow the injunction um, to depart from them that are unclean. That's a
mhm,
biblical passage which can be interpreted in various ways. Depart from them that are unclean and found our own autonomous churches. Now, church is a complicated word. It would be better to say, because it's better to use the word church for a national or a large institution. So we could say congregation or gathered church, something like that. We need a different set of words.
mhm,
So these things began to pop up in the 1560s, 1570s, 1580s, treated very badly by the government, which didn't like these movements. People were executed for saying this. A number of people flee to the Netherlands, where there's toleration and they can do what they want in the Netherlands. And so it's a recurring motif within the Puritan movement that a few people, not many, a few people are going to separate, the meaning withdraw from the official church. That's what separate means, separatism, and found their own churches. So this is, from one point of view, schismatic.
mm.
It's breaking the fabric of Christ, of Christendom. It's shattering the fundamental unity of Christendom. And of course, all of Protestantism was, from a Catholic point of view, schismatic. But anyway, going back to the Puritans, so they're trying to hold on to the Church of England, but then there are these separatists who emerge in very small numbers. So then James I becomes the king in 1603 after Elizabeth dies, and he doesn't like the Puritans at all. He had experience with them in Scotland, so when he comes back, comes all the way down, travels all the way down from Scotland to get to London, he makes it pretty clear that he's going to defend the bishops has a famous expression, no bishop, no king. So there's another, as it were, crisis, a little crisis about do you obey the king or do you break off? Most people thought that he was enough of a moderate that they could work with him, but a few people break off. And they're in a particular part of England, eastern part of England, and they form their little congregations. 2 ministers are involved who renounce their ordinations in the Church of England and accept new appointments by the local people. And then they're punished. They're going to be punished pretty harshly. So they get on a ship and they leave for the Netherlands. So they go to the Netherlands and they go to Leiden. And today you can go and still see the houses that they owned. And there's a little museum there for them. And then they're in Leiden, and things are not going so well. So for one thing, their children are learning Dutch. And they see acculturation creeping in. We're going to lose our very distinctive identity as a rule-bound, spirit-bound, Jesus-bound group of people if we stay, even though the Netherlands is Protestant. We're going to lose our particular identity. So by hook and crook, the government in England says, we're not going to bother you. Go ahead and leave for the New World. There's a group of merchants who say, we'll pay the costs if you're going over. And so the Mayflower leaves. It leaves late. This is very important to the story. Most of the ships coming to Massachusetts in the 1630s left in March or April. That meant they arrived in June, late May, June. The Mayflower didn't leave until late September, delayed by various circumstances in England. And so it arrived in November off Cape Cod. Now they had a patent, that means basically a gift of land south of Cape Cod, but they couldn't get their ship to go around Cape Cod because there's a complicated thing. So they turn north, and they end up in a bay called Plymouth, which has already been named Plymouth by John Smith. And they go ashore in November, and then they start to build their houses, and they settle in. Now the tragedy of that journey and the tragedy of the experience there is that when they left the ship, many of them had gotten pneumonia the conditions on the ship. There were 100 people jammed on this small ship.
Because it wasn't just Pilgrims, right? I mean, so people.
No, they had hired servants. They had people like Miles Standish, who was a trained soldier, to kind of keep them sharp, and they had coopers, people to make barrels, and then they had the women and children, of course, too. So about just a little over half of them were from the Leiden congregation.
But there were other is that correct that the Mayflower also had other passengers that didn't have anything to do with the whole?
Well, no, they were all part of the enterprise. They just were not. Let's put it this way: they were not a covenanted people as a whole.
I got you.
Some were covenanted, some were not.
Okay.
I mean,
so it wasn't like it was a ship for hire that happened to have a certain percentage.
No. This was not a ship going back.
Separate.
This is the only time the Mayflower ever crossed the Atlantic.
Gotcha. Okay.
So they land, and so the tragedy is, they have to try to build a house. How they manage to do that in the wintertime and get a saw going, and it's just astonishing. Anyway, to come to the close here, half of them died. Men, women, and children died by the spring. So there are only 50 of them left by the spring. Now, this would have made most people go back on the ship when it left, but these are tough-minded people, so they stay, and they're determined to grow a colony. The next year, 1621, more people arrive from Leiden, so they gradually build up their community, and with other people coming. So I want to talk about the word liberty.
Okay.
Because one of the myths about the Pilgrims is that they're one of the founders of our tradition of liberty. So we have to be careful here when we use the word liberty. It has all kinds of nuances, as you know well, biblical and non-biblical and political theory and practice. At any rate, so for them, liberty meant the Pauline motion, St. Paul's idea. One is liberty from sin. And then that's, salvation by Jesus, by the sacrifice of Jesus. But it also means for them liberty from the human inventions that Catholicism had created, not in Scripture, but still in the Church of England. So it's liberty from false doctrine and false practices in the Church of England. That's the meaning of liberty to them. They're going to be able to practice true religion as they understand it when they reach Massachusetts, when they reach Plymouth. Is that pretty clear?
Oh yeah, that makes
So
sense.
it's a very specific biblical theological meaning of liberty. It has nothing to do with civil society, nothing to do with governments or things like that at all. It's a very powerful meaning because it moved them to leave England, to become separatists and to come across the ocean.
But it's not the liberty tree that Samuel Adams would be hanging out under,
No,
right? It's
no,
not
it's
the
not that at
same
all.
kind of thought process as liberty.
That's based
we're
on
talking about the 250th.
That's based on English Whig political thought. Yeah, exactly. So the second thing to say is about the relationship with the Native Americans. Now, there's a lot of ink being spilled in recent years about the relationship with the Native Americans. So they came with their heads stuffed with images about who the Native Americans were. They'd never seen a Native American. And a lot of this was uncomplimentary to the Native Americans, I should say. They were barbarous. They lived outside civilization. They deteriorated. They were children of Adam and Eve. There was no question about that. But they were children who had gotten away from, the ordinary rules of life.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the good news was that almost from the day one, two friendly Indians showed up from the very small number of Indians on Cape Cod, living on Cape Cod at the time. One was named Samoset, who actually walked all the way from Maine. He heard about them, and he walked all the way from Maine, and he spoke English because he'd been taken captive and lived in England for a while. He was a sachem, actually, a leader, very, very experienced man. And he said, I'll help you. I'll help you figure out, how to get along with the Indians who were there, who were a different tribe. And then there was a man named Squanto. We don't know much about Squanto. He died pretty early, but he was the one who said, now you're going to have to grow some corn, impossible to grow wheat in this. They didn't have a plow or anything like that. But corn, you dig a hole in the ground and stick some kernels in, and then you put some rotting fish in the plow. And that's the fertilizer for the corn. And by jingo, it worked. So they're off raising corn. By the way, they were English. They never had eaten corn.
I hadn't thought about that. Okay.
Corn is the English word for wheat. But here in America, of course, it's these kernels, which, by the way, are very, very nutritious. They're more nutritious than wheat. So Squanto did them a big favor. And then the local Indian sachem, he was presiding over a very diminished group of Indians who had been hit by a disease. We don't know what the disease was, a European disease brought by passing sailors and fishermen. And about 3/4 of his tribe had died. So he was in a kind of a weakened position. So that was lucky. They were lucky in that regard. So instead of having a kind of fired up group of people saying, what are you doing here? They had a very weakened group who said, maybe you can help us defend ourselves against our enemies to the west of us. That makes sense?
Oh, sure.
So there's a long period of peace, a very long period of peace with the Native Americans on Cape Cod, growing out of these situations. But, people could say that, well, they were taking Indian land, whatever. There are various nuances to this story. So then we come to early November of 1621, and so there's a feast, a harvest feast, and this in the 19th century got celebrated as the first Thanksgiving, and it got celebrated as a time when Indians and whites sat down together to a feast, and that's not what actually happened. It was not a religious service. Thanksgivings in English Protestantism were clergy called or church called, where you gave thanks for divine providence and so forth and so on. The Pilgrims were certainly thankful that they had survived the winter,
Sure.
but it was not officially a Thanksgiving. It was a harvest feast. And it's unclear whether some Indians sat down with them or not. And I don't want to try to settle that question. We'll never really know. The sources are unclear.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with David Hall by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi Christian University in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.